Inflation is like an old Russian refrigerator. Once it hits you, it's pretty painful. And I've been telling you for the past year that inflation ain't going away. It's definitely not transitory.
In the end, it will be transitory. And
However, there were a few people in the industry defending the Fed and still saying inflation was transitory just a month ago.
Weight of the evidence is finally going Powell's way. Team Transitory is going to win.
Of course, just 2 weeks later, the Fed themselves came out and said, well,
I think it's probably a good time to retire that word and try to explain more clearly.
Team Transitory have skipped out of town, took the first flight out, and basically left a whole lot of blank checks.
Just being silly. Don't be silly.
However, surprisingly, I'm not even mad at Jim Cramer for saying this. It would be like being mad at a donkey for being a donkey or a door being a door. It's just a door. It's just Jim. Just in June, he told you he's giving you his blessing to invest in Didi. Check this out.
Got my blessing to bet on Didi. I would try to get as many shares as you can. DI.
Global ride-hailing giant Didi now saying it will delist from the New York Stock Exchange less than 6 months after going public. Didi shares have been under a lot of pressure since that IPO in June.
And then we obviously know how the Didi story panned out. 60% later, we're talking about one of the biggest fails in history. Jim Cramer has been known to make a few mistakes, so I'm not really mad at him for saying this. The question is, how do we feel about the Federal Reserve?
The incoming data are very much consistent with the view that these are factors that will wane over time and that inflation will then move down.
The Federal Reserve had one job. You only had one job, which is to keep a stable pricing environment for the people basically to be able to buy bread, shoes, and housing. They failed. Somehow, the guy who was in charge, who completely got the call wrong, calling it transitory for the year, now got his job back. Do you know of anybody in any industry who would screw up completely, like a 180 screw up, completely get the call wrong, get people in a lot of trouble and get his job back? And it's like nothing just happened? And now we're stuck. Whether you think COVID is serious or you think it's not, it doesn't really matter because all odds, your government thinks it is, which means it's going to be way more aggressive about working remotely, less travel, and whatnot, essentially increasing unemployment. So what you're getting in the next upcoming year is a lot more unemployment, a lot more inflation, and that is the definition of stagflation. The problem is the Federal Reserve acted like a rookie in the military. They went out on their first mission, heard the noise in the bushes, and emptied the whole magazine on that noise. Now, the bad guys are coming from the other end. They have nothing in the clip. All they can do is hold their cojones and pray for the best. That's literally what the Fed just did. They emptied their load the first time around, not stopping, not preserving any ammo. Now we're going back, or Omicron, whatever's coming next. It doesn't seem like COVID is going away, at least the way governments perceive it. It seems it's still here to stay, but the Fed can't print any more money. It's done because at this point, look at inflation. But if you ask the Fed, well, they haven't done anything wrong. While they cooked you like a lobster, essentially telling you, well, this is completely transitory, we think it's a little bit more persistent, but it's okay. And then going all the way to, well, we think transitory was kind of, misunderstood. And then really going all out saying, well, we're retiring the word transitory. They cooked you like a lobster and you didn't notice. The problem is that we left these guys in charge over our kids, essentially the economy. Now, instead of having two responsible adults, two responsible babysitters, we got freaking Harry and Marv from Home Alone that fed the kids pizza and candies for a whole week. And pretty much the only excuse they'll give you, well, the kids asked for this. They threw a tantrum. They really wanted the candy and the pizza. They would not eat their vegetables, so we just, gave it to them for a whole week. And just to make sure you understand how horrible this week was, let's look at the past 22 months. In the past 22 months, the United States printed 80% of all-time dollar printing. Yes, 80% of the dollar was printed in the past 22 months. That's a whole lot of pizza and a whole lot of candy. So at this point, you're all probably basically on the floor. What can we do, Tom? What can the government do here? It's a little bit of a tricky situation because it's basically a shitstorm. I'll explain why. Back in the 80s, Paul Volcker actually raised interest way up high, and it took a while, but, it stabilized inflation. Now, a lot of people seem to think that this is the only solution and the sole solution is just raising interest rates. But raising interest rates on their own will not help the economy. And I'll explain in a second why. That's exactly why raising interest rates never worked in the 70s before Paul Volcker, if you actually go and research some history. People seem to think it's because the US will go bankrupt if they just raise interest rates right now. That's not how it works. I'll explain. Basically, there is a certain rule that tells you how much interest you need in the market to actually fight inflation. And it's called the Taylor rule. It doesn't really matter right now. It's basically 150% of your inflation. So let's say we have a 3% inflation in the normal market. So we're probably looking at 4.5% interest. Problem is, right now we're looking at a whole lot more than 3%. In fact, right now it's 7% as of November, probably going to end Q1 at 10%. If everything goes to plan. I don't know whose plan, but let's say we have a 10%. You know what? Let's just stay with 7. Let's say it's 7%. Let's say that inflation stops growing right now, just stays at 7. Right now, we're looking at 10.5% interest. This is what we need today to stop inflation. The problem is that according to all data, right now we have 4 times more government debt than what we had in the 80s. So essentially, every single percent you're going to raise interest, it will cost the government $220 billion more in interest because the government, it has to repay this debt. And every percent will cost $220 billion. So let's do a quick math. We're talking about 10.5%. So roughly $2.4 trillion more in debt repayments for the government if they raise interest right now to 10.5%. Now, the problem is, and a lot of people get this thing wrong, is they think, well, this is going to bankrupt the U.S. government. That's not really how it works. The U.S. government can't really go bankrupt. They can print as much money as they want. But if your solution to basically having to pay $2.4 trillion more because you're trying to fight inflation by printing more money, essentially you did nothing. So let me explain. Because in this situation, this is just a cyclical transaction. Nothing really happened. There's nothing you did here to alleviate inflation. Now, the other end of the spectrum will tell you, well, Tom, they can just raise taxes like crazy, go back to 70% taxes, and that's how you need to actually print more money, and that's how you can alleviate inflation. The problem is that 2021 isn't 1980. There's a lot more global mobility, and there's a race to the bottom in tax. So if the U.S. raises taxes, the flight from the U.S., and by flight, I don't mean the one you take to the vacation. I mean by escape, by corporations and wealthy individuals, the ones that actually pay a lot more tax than the rest of the population, will be insane. So they're going to run away to cheaper locations, tax-wise. And that's actually pretty insanely shown by the Laffer curve. You can clearly see that beyond a certain point, increases taxes actually reduces your tax collection. And right now, and that's not me saying that, according to the OECD data, the equilibrium point for corporate tax is about 21%. That's exactly where the US is at right now. So raising corporate rates to 40, 50% is actually going to end up with less tax collections for the US, meaning they'll have to print more money, meaning no solution for inflation. So how do you solve this? Because so far it sounds like a doomsday solution. Well, you solve this by a combination of 2 things, and one of them is going to sound insanely radically kind of illogical to you, and I'll explain. So the first thing, you do have to raise interest rates, at least to 10.5%, which is radical, but I mean, Volcker did it in the 80s. You still have to do it today because it's the same situation. And unfortunately, most people forget or don't know that while Paul Volcker was increasing interest rates in the 80s, there was another factor in play. There was complete deregulation and lowering of taxations by the Reagan administration. So this government, while raising interest rates, was creating a nice little infrastructure for an economic boom by lowering tax rates and removing regulation. When you do it, essentially, you're giving the market the power to explode out of the stratosphere. And I know it sounds radical, but contrary to what you've been told, lowering taxes, deregulating will end up actually with the US collecting way more tax than they ever did, ending up paying the $2.4 trillion they need to raise interest to above 10%, which they absolutely have to do in the near future. Because otherwise, we have to simply take Jerome Powell's word that inflation, and I'm quoting, will be transitory in the end. And if inflation is still not transitory, it's okay. It just means it's not the end yet. See you tomorrow.